Welcome to AM Insider, a production of our own. In this podcast, we will have a series of informative discussions tackling the adoption of additive manufacturing, answering those burning questions and swapping experiences. Learn from experienced individuals on how innovation can push the boundaries of what is possible. Hey, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Justin Hopkins, and with me here as always is Dustin Klimpkin. Let's get inside AM. All right, welcome everybody to the next AM Insider. Joining me here as always is Dustin Klimpkin. How are you doing today, Dustin?
Doing well. Looking forward to another deep dive discussion. Today should be a different angle than what we've approached in the past, so it should be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, how did we get introduced to today's guest? I think it was through a connection of a previous guest. Is that correct?
Yeah, since we've been starting this up, a lot of our previous interviews have been through people you or I have worked with over the years. Our next guest, Ryan, is a referral from one of our previous guests, which is always great because it expands beyond my knowledge or experience, or maybe yours as well.
Yeah, I think it's always good when the network starts to grow and you get introduced to new people. And I think that'll be a good point to invite in Ryan and get to know him a little better and see where our conversation goes today. So Ryan, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Can you give us a little bit of your background and tell us what you've done in additive and how you got there?
Sure, yeah. My name is Ryan Kircher. I'm a principal additive manufacturing engineer at a company called RMS Company. We're a medical device contract manufacturer. So we make parts for medical device companies. I've been in additive. It'll be 20 years in December of this year. So
congratulations.
Yeah, it's a long time. And how I got involved in it was more just by chance. I've been in the industry so long that it wasn't a career path anybody really thought about in high school or college. I went to Colorado School of Mines in Golden, Colorado, and studied metallurgy. Right out of school, I was working at an auto manufacturing plant in Michigan. But one of my good friends from school was working at a small company that had just started in Golden called Medical Modeling, which was trying to use mostly polymer SLA type printing in the medical industry. Long story short, I wanted to move back to Colorado, and my friend got me an interview with the president of Medical Modeling, and I moved back and started working with one of the first metal additive systems that was ever installed in the U.S. back in 2005 or 2006. And I've been in the industry ever since.
What kind of metal printing were you guys doing? Was it like titanium or what was the material?
Yeah. We were using the first generation of the RCAM EBM system. That's electron beam melting. So it's a powder bed fusion type process using an electron beam as a power source. We were trying to figure out what to make with Ti 6.4 alloy. The president of the company had bought it thinking that patient matched implants would probably be the likely application that we'd be using. But we found out within the first 3 or 4 months that the world really wasn't ready for patient matched additive manufactured parts yet. So we pivoted and focused on trying to make off-the-shelf implants.
Okay. And then where did you go from there? So you've got experience in metal and also polymers, but you've always kind of stayed in the medical side of it.
I've dabbled in a lot of things. I spent about 7 years at Medical Modeling. When we first started trying to figure out what to do with things, until the time we got something made that was cleared by the FDA that we could actually help our customer put on the market, was probably 3 years. It took us a really long time to figure out the right applications, how to make the parts right, and all the things like process validations, quality control, terminology, and specifications that didn't exist. We had to start from scratch and figure out how to get all that stuff in place so that we could actually have a process that the FDA was okay with. So that took us 3 or 4 years. And then we developed that. I stayed there, developing new applications for a couple of years. And then I actually left and went to work at Lockheed Martin for a couple of years, again, focused on metal additive. And while I was at Lockheed Martin, Medical Modeling was bought by 3D Systems. And essentially, built a nice brand new state-of-the-art facility in Littleton, Colorado, and convinced me to come back and work at 3D Systems. So I did that for a couple more years, then did some consulting for a little bit, and then I landed at RMS, which is where I'm at currently. The vast majority of my career has been medical device and metal, but I have worked on some polymer processes in the past and in the aerospace industry for a little bit too.
That's great. So you're in a field that, we can face challenges in an additive, which is regulations in the FDA. Like you said, it took 2 or 5 years to get some of the processes put in place. Can you dive into that a little bit? Because I think that's an area where people think, oh, additive is a great fit in medical, but they don't realize what they're getting into and what those processes that they have to go through and be prepared for. When we think of additive, we think of it being quick, but you always forget about the regulations and what has to happen.
Yeah. At the end of the day, there needs to be terminology and standards so that you, your customers, regulatory bodies, everyone can be on the same page. And none of that existed. We had to create it ourselves. A lot of the first products that were cleared for sale in the US were using their own specifications. So customers wrote their own specifications that they then leveraged on us as a contract manufacturer. And that was the starting point. And a lot of those standards were based off of old material standards. That's a trend you see in additive a lot, where we try to fit additive materials into the space that conventional materials already reside. We had a lot of standards that referenced wrought material or cast material. Even though what we were making was fundamentally different material, we still had to find ways of making it conform to those standards so that it was familiar to people and a way we could communicate it. That was challenging. And then, the FDA requires you to do significant risk analysis and figure out ways of controlling your process. If you can't verify the output of your process, then you have to do what's called a process validation. That's a big exercise of doing qualification steps and looking at things from a statistical standpoint to kind of prove that you understand your process window, have it under control, and can predict the outcomes. Laying the groundwork and the framework for how to do that also took an enormous amount of time and thought. We did our best back then, but after looking back, none of it was perfect. That's what I spend a decent amount of my time doing even today, still working in that same sort of area, but trying to figure out better ways of doing some of those things.
So, Ryan, I'd like to peel back the onion a little bit more on that further. I see this happen all the time. I'm sure you have as well. I mean, I've been in the industry now about 13 years. You've been 20 years, so you've seen a lot. And something that you've probably seen come up many times is upper management always wants some kind of guarantee. When you work in innovation, it's really hard to give some kind of guarantee. For example, with what you're talking about, you said it took about 3 years to figure that out. Looking back now, and given from what you thought it was going to take to then 3 years later, do you think the juice was worth the squeeze? Do you think the company benefited, or did it benefit in a different way that you couldn't have predicted? Companies big and small are always trying to figure out where they invest their time, money, resources, and personnel. I'm curious from your perspective with that particular situation and maybe other ones, what you would say to that.
You got to have some deep pockets. You got to have some time. I think if you go and run the economics of this might be an economical thing to do via additive, and you don't incorporate or think about the literally millions of dollars you're going to have to spend up front to do some of these qualification and validation steps, and then amortize that cost into the cost of doing stuff additively, you can lose a lot of money. I don't think it's news that a lot of people have done that in the past, right? You have to have a business model that's going to be able to reap the benefits of all that money you spend setting up the systems to begin with. Everyone underestimates how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take. It literally costs millions of dollars, and it takes years for almost anybody to set up an additive facility that's going to be able to grow and have a robust quality system. You got to have the expertise, the right mindset, the people and experience to do all that stuff too. If you invest and you do it right, and then you have money and capital and owners or a board willing to invest more to grow the business, it can be successful. There's probably, for every one success story, 10 stories of people who were unsuccessful, but it is something that can be very successful if done right.
With the groundwork laid with certain applications in the medical space, do you think it's easier for people to come in and prove things out because it's already been done before with the FDA, or is it just as difficult?
It's definitely getting easier. It's easier than it was 20 years ago, for sure. People have laid the groundwork. Everyone always likes to say the FDA is really difficult to work with. At least as far as facilitating the use of additive manufacturing, they've gone out of their way to kind of try to help the industry along, right? They published guidance documents about 10 years ago, the kinds of things that they were looking for when people try to clear a device using additive manufacturing, right? So they've done a lot of the work of helping people understand what the needs are going to be. I think that helps. Fortunately, additive has had a pretty good success rate in the medical device industry. We haven't had any catastrophic issues or failures that I think people were maybe worried about 20 years, 15 years ago when we were clearing the first devices. There's probably a higher level of trust with certain suppliers that the FDA has too, which helps. Certain expertise that people have in knowing what the FDA really is going to look for. You can get things cleared through the FDA relatively quickly using additive manufacturing today if you know what you're doing. If you don't, it can take a while.
And Ryan is exactly correct. For those of you listening and maybe learning about this process, you can Google search technical considerations for additively manufactured medical devices. And I got it pulled up on my side of the screen right now. And the first draft was issued May 10th, 2016. You're right. It was almost 10 years ago already. That time does go fast.
Not a bad guess. I know they're trying to revise it already. That's how fast things move in this industry. It's a really good starting point, right? So, having tools like that definitely help facilitate things. I think another thing that a lot of people underestimate is when you're manufacturing a medical device, the additive portion of it takes probably somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks from the time we push print on in one of our additive systems to the point where we have a device that's ready to ship to one of our customers, right? But most of our builds are only 2 or 3 days long. So of that 6 to 8 weeks, the additive portion is only a couple days, right? There's so many other things involved with manufacturing a medical device. To be successful, you have to understand how additive interplays with all those other processes, or even have the capabilities of doing all those processes, right? There's a handful of different business models out there where some people focus just on the additive portion and have their customers work with a different supplier to do all those other things. But, the additive portion, sure, it's complicated, whatever, but it's only a small part of the entire picture. And a lot of people underestimate all the other things that you need to take in consideration too.
Absolutely.
Can you highlight some of those other things that, you mentioned people, so people are always important. Like, what are the keys to success, you would say?
For medical device, it really boils down to quality and having capabilities of doing a lot of downstream processes, right? Almost everything that RMS makes goes into some mill or CNC operation to do something, right? Additive's good at some things. It's not good at other things. We are adamant about trying not to print threads and then tap them with some hand tap or something to kind of clean them up, right? We put them in a mill and we machine them. So figuring out what you should additively manufacture and what you shouldn't, and rely on other conventional manufacturing techniques is an important consideration. One of the things that's unique about powder bed fusion additive is that we're building parts in a bed of powder. How you make sure you get all of that excess powder off the parts and are cleaning the parts is also extremely important, right? So powder removal processes aren't trivial. And then inspection, right? So if people are leveraging additive correctly, they're hopefully making organic or latticey or porous structures that do well in osseointegration. Those are hard to inspect with conventional methods. You can't use a CMM to go and measure intentionally rough lattice porous structure, right? So thinking about how are we going to inspect this thing? Those types of questions can really delay the development of a product.
Circling back to my original question, is it worth it? There are things that you got to get lined up. You got to get your capital lined up, your team lined up, the focus lined up, trying to figure out new processes or adapting to previous methods. From everything that you've experienced over the last 20 years, do you think that's worth it?
I think, first of all, you have to think about the value that additive adds to the parts before, right? Like if you're going to try to use additive manufacturing as a replacement for making things that you can make in other ways, you're going to struggle. I mean, there are some applications that I've worked on where you can additively manufacture a part for less money and resources that it takes to machine it, but they're far and in between. So almost everything we make has some sort of functionality that's designed into the part that wouldn't exist if it wasn't for additive manufacturing, right? In my space right now, a lot of that is porous lattice structures for osseointegration. What makes it worth it is that you can design those structures and create structures that you can't make any other way. But then you're also avoiding a secondary process that was conventionally done. The historical way of making those types of devices would have been to machine or forge a part and then do some sort of secondary coating process, whether that's sintered bead or plasma spraying with titanium, right? With additive, you can make the part and put a superior lattice or porous structure on the part at the same time. It's worth it in those situations because you're saving money compared to conventional manufacturing and you're adding value to the part. But RMS is somewhat unique in that we have all these other capabilities and expertise in-house on how to do all these things before RMS ever decided to invest in additive manufacturing, right? So, I mean, if you're building a facility and an organization from ground up and you have no capabilities whatsoever, you've never manufactured a medical device and sold it to anyone in the past, that's going to be a hard business to start because you are going to need tons of resources, not only from the additive side, but all those other sorts of post processes, regulatory expertise and stuff like that. Whether that's worth it or not, I don't know. But if you're a contract manufacturer already and you have a strong track record in a big business space, is it worth exploring bringing additive manufacturing as an additional capability into your facility? I think the answer there is definitely. I think that's where we're seeing the success in the medical device additive implementation. It's people who've already been doing things in the past who are bringing additive as an additional capability into their facility.
I think that's a really good observation, Ryan, because you're exactly right. If you're just going to be a print shop for, name your application, that's one thing. But to really be successful, you got to have a lot of extra infrastructure behind it to support it, like you talked about. And not everything is going to make sense to be produced via additive as well. To have multiple manufacturing processes or approaches to solve whatever problem is before you really makes you a powerful one-stop shop.
Not only that, it allows you to look at things objectively and decide whether additive is a good process to make a particular part. If you're just a print shop, you're going to try to make it work regardless. But at RMS, we have the luxury of being able to say, hey, you know what? This might be a better part to work with our milling department on. And we've done cost comparisons between additive and other processes to decide the best way of making a part for a customer, right? And it's not just necessarily the overall part. It might be a feature of a part. Is it better to try to additively manufacture this feature, or is it more economical to build in some extra material and mill that feature, right? So we're able to make those critical decisions that aren't as easy to make when you're looking at it through the lens of only having certain capabilities.
And if you just kind of expand outward and think of a day-to-day example, I try to relate a lot of additive things to things that people understand. And someone once taught me to relate it to cars if you can, because most people understand cars. And so if you think of a car dealership, a lot of times they're selling gas vehicles, diesel vehicles, and electric vehicles of all different sizes and shapes. It's probably very similar to what you're talking about here, because then whoever shows up, odds are you're going to have some kind of solution for them, and you're not going to be pigeonholed into just selling electric vehicles or just diesel vehicles.
RMS has a handful of different additive capabilities, but we're primarily a laser powder bed fusion provider, right? We use powder bed fusion of Ti-6-4 is our main capability. And, right after this call, I have to have a call with a customer who wants us to make some parts, and they're just too small for they're too fine detailed parts for what we can do in our laser powder bed fusion system. Even today, I think you have to look critically at, can I do this? Does it make sense to do this? We say no to a lot of things just because we don't feel our technology as it stands right now is a good fit, right? We're constantly exploring other processes to complement what we're working on, but I think that's also a very important thing, is just to be honest with yourself and your customers and know whether or not you're going down the right road to begin with, right?
With all the devices you've worked on, what has been the most interesting thing maybe it wasn't a medical device, or maybe it was just a component, like you're saying, that we're just going to additively do this part of the device. What has been the most interesting thing that you've worked on?
Man, that's such a hard. I've worked on some really cool things. Honestly, like there's parts that people have made that are cool. I find that what gets me really excited is when I figure out a new process or a new way of evaluating parts, technological breakthroughs that help make tons of products. But if I had to say some products or people that have made some really interesting parts, early on in my career, I worked with a company called 4Web Medical, and they were one of the first companies, probably the first company, that got a spinal fusion cage cleared through the FDA using additive manufacturing. I remember when they came knocking on our door when I was at Medical Modeling, I was like, there's no way I can make this work. Because it was, and it still is today, in my opinion, one of the more novel uses of additive for that particular device. I mean, there's probably now 30 or 40, at least, different inner body fusion cages that are cleared by the FDA. But I still think that one, as far as its use of additive, is probably still one of the top. And for something that's been around that long in the medical industry, that's saying a lot. I think that's a really interesting part that I've worked on. Another company that I've worked with over the course of almost my entire career is a company called SI Bone. They work on a big screw for the SI joint. What's really interesting about that company is that they're constantly innovating. It makes a really nice show on my wall. I have a wall full of parts that I've worked with over the years. And what's really cool about them is that I have 4 or 5 different iterations of different cleared devices that they've worked on over the years. So they got their first one cleared 15 years ago, but they're constantly working on pushing their designs and making new parts that have better functionality, are longer, bigger, can take care of different types of cases. It's a really good case study. You look at their first device that they got cleared using additive, and it's nothing special anymore, right? But now you look at what we're making today, and it's pretty cool. Part of that's because of design software, right? I think that's been one of the bigger changes from when I started in this industry to now, is just the computing power and the types of softwares that are out there to design parts that didn't exist when we first started. But those are two of my favorite applications, I would say. It's just like the SI product from its history to where it is today, and the innovation of that 4Web spinal cage a long time ago.
Yeah, you mentioned software, and that was going to be one of my next things is to ask. You mentioned that software had gotten better. How do you feel about what happens to it after you generate it in the software? I can only imagine the textures that you guys have to produce. What do the systems have to do to take all those tessellations and triangles to process these fine details that you guys have to add in? One thing's designing it, the other is still getting it to the printer. Has that gotten better, or is it a struggle?
It's gotten better. Another big piece of that is actually evaluating what comes out of the printer and how you evaluate it, right? You can design something that has, for example, 60 micron struts or something, and then go put it into a EBM system. You're not going to get 60 micron struts out of the EBM system, right? So, and with the medical device market and the types of products we're making, we really are still pushing the limits as far as resolution of the process. We can't really make things much less than 200 microns in diameter as far as a strut or a lattice structure, right? And that really hasn't changed much in the last 15 or 20 years. What has changed is the software's ability to deal with those types of files and create different configurations of those 20 or 200 micron struts. I remember when I was working on some of the first products, we were trying to put a lattice porous coating on the back of an acetabular hip cup. And just the amount of file size and memory it took to create a build platform of hip cups with that lattice structure was almost enough to cripple any state-of-the-art computer. We had to hack the systems and fed the printers solid designs, and then messed around with hatch spacing and printer parameters to intentionally create a lattice pore structure, right? As far as the design was concerned, there was no lattice, if that makes sense. It was all done within the printer to avoid not having enough memory on the computers. Now you look at today with things like NTOP and implicit modeling, it's mind-boggling how much more capabilities we have today.
The amount of data that can be generated is unbelievable, to the point where you don't ever really think that the printer will be the problem when it comes to that. It's a lot of data to fulfill. It's interesting that it hasn't gotten significantly better on the printer side of the processing, considering how complicated software can make parts these days without as much of a struggle.
Yeah, I mean, part of it's because there hasn't been a huge need, because we can make the types of structures at the scale that we need to for osseointegration, right? And at the end of the day, I think one of the limitations isn't necessarily the machines, it's the raw material powder too. We can't really do powder bed additive like with lasers and electron beams with powder much finer than we're using today due to safety and some other physical reasons. If you need to make stuff that has a much finer resolution, you got to start moving into other types of processes like sinter-based additive, where you can use slurries, fine powders, and stuff like that. As far as laser powder bed fusion goes, we're always been at a fundamental limit as far as resolution. But to your point, you have a design, you put it into a printer, how do you know what you're getting out? I think that's one of the biggest downfalls and gaps in this industry, is that you can take that file, put it on 5 different manufacturers' laser powder bed fusion systems, and get 5 parts that visually look different. How you describe those visual differences and the terminologies and all that stuff doesn't really exist, right? So you just know I'm getting parts that are different out of these 5 printers. I went and did all my testing, validation, qualification, 510K clearances on this particular serial number of printer, right? Or manufacturer's printer. I'm going to make my parts with that because I know that it's giving me what I need. I know that these other systems are giving me something different. It's created a situation in our industry, at least, that almost every cleared device is kind of limited to where it can be made. It needs to be made on a particular platform, a certain manufacturer, and sometimes even certain machines at that manufacturer's site. Long term, I have a vision that will develop the right nomenclatures, standards, test methods, terminology and stuff to be able to really describe those differences and then be able to specify them so that, technically you can go get things made on any system that can still meet the same criteria.
I would agree. That's an important part because, like you said, even within the same manufacturer with the same OEM machine, you may get a different output from that contract manufacturer, because sometimes we hear that, right? It's like, I've been using this group and it seems inconsistent unless you can isolate down to exactly what you're doing, or you can do it on another end that you're feeding the same parameters to the printer. You might get a different result. The closer we get to important things like what you guys are doing, the sooner the better, as far as opening up how many manufacturers people can use.
RMS runs 33 laser powder bed fusion systems making Ti-64 implants. And we feel confident that we can take any digital file and put it on any of those 33 printers and get within known variants the same product out, right? And that variance is worked into our quality control plans. It can be done. It just takes some diligence and understanding the behavior of the systems and what the key inputs are, and then having sensitive ways of measuring the outputs of the process.
So given our conversation so far, is there anything that comes to mind that you think more people should know about, especially given the audience who's listening in?
I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize, I've been part of panel discussions and things in the past. And, one of the sometimes the topic of the entire panel discussion is like, what is it going to take to make additive a viable manufacturing method or mainstream or be accepted? And I feel like the medical devices accepted it, and it is a viable method of manufacturing medical devices. RMS sold our 1 millionth off-the-shelf medical implant in June of this year. That's a lot of people that are walking around with additively manufactured implants, right? I don't think people understand the scale that it really is being used in the medical industry, right? And we're just one of many suppliers out there. I mean, Stryker has 3 or 4 times the amount of additive systems that RMS does, and they're cranking out implants, I'm sure, at a scale that's bigger than ours too. So, that's one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize. The defense industry and the aerospace industry have been a little bit slow to adopt additive, but when you look at medical, there's a lot of successes that we've had in the last 10 years that a lot of people don't recognize.
I would agree. And I think that because things are a little bit more custom, it's a better fit, and in a sense, that's where there's an opportunity. To what you mentioned before, it's like you need to use the right process for the part. Don't print it if it doesn't make sense, and machine it if it does. I think that's where a lot of people get caught up, is that they can't decide what needs to be additively manufactured.
I think another part of it is the number of parts you need to make too. Medical devices are unique, right? We've already established it costs a lot of money to set up these processes. If you're setting up all these processes to make, 10 or 15 brackets or, fuel nozzles a year, those parts get really expensive. So we're making tens of thousands of parts a year, hundreds of thousands of parts a year on all of our printers. That's a good number of parts. Another place where additive struggles, though, is things like automotive, where you need millions of parts. It's to scale additive to that extent is a little more challenging. So there's kind of a sweet spot, at least for laser powder bed fusion, where you have to look at how many parts you need, because there's a decent amount of capital expense associated with investing in additive that doesn't necessarily make sense if you need to make millions of parts too, right? So there's a sweet spot. That's important to think about. That's why spine has been a really good application for additive. There's a lot of reasons why spine is a really good success story for the use of additive. From the amount of parts we can make in a day or two on a printer to the different sizes of implants that need to be made. It's a really good example of what you should look for as far as what parts fit with our capabilities in additive today.
Yeah, and as you've been talking, I've been doing a little searching online to try to figure out what were some of the earliest FDA-approved additively manufactured devices. I got a screenshot saved here on my computer of a headline that says, 100,000 patients later, the 3D printed hip is a decade old and going strong, specifically referring to a Delta TT cup that was the world's first 3D printed hip cup. And then I asked ChatGPT, I said, hey, what was the first, FDA or 510K approved device? And it gave me an answer of like something from 2014, 2015. And I queried it a little bit here and found that its information was going off what was in the hype or in the news at the time, which I said was around 2014, 2015, even though there were a lot of devices earlier than that. The reason I bring this up is just because you think you're the first person to do something, it might not be the case, because as you probably found out, kind of what you were mentioning earlier, Ryan, is sometimes you're trying to shoehorn some new process into an old process that doesn't exactly work perfectly, but you have to follow what's already established. And I know when you're trying to do that, that can sometimes be really challenging.
Yeah, I think the first devices were probably cleared in about 2008 or 2009. It's one of those things where people will always argue about who was the first to get cleared. Everyone likes to think about that. It's funny you brought up the hip cup story, because everyone wants to consider that a success story. And it really was one of the first applications to take off in the additive space. But 100,000 of those over 10 years is not a lot. I look at hip cups as a cautionary tale. It made sense a little bit, and you could make hip cups, but there's millions of those implanted in people a year. About 5 or 10% of them are additive at most, right? Where you look at spine, the vast majority of spinal implants today are additive. So you have to ask yourself, why aren't hip cups made additively manufactured when they were one of the first things that we figured out how to make? And it boils down to economics, scalability, and feasibility. You look at the Delta TT, I think that was, is that a Lima product or something like that? I can't remember. But
it says Lima Corporate.
And they're a small to mid-size orthopedic manufacturer. You look at the big companies, J&J, Stryker, Smith & Nephew, DePuy. Are they offering standard additively manufactured hip cups as their primary hip cup offering? No. And the reason is they've been making those products for a really long time. They've invested a lot of capital and equipment to make those the way they've always made them. For someone to come in and say, you can additively manufacture those things and put a different lattice or pore structure on there, it's probably going to cost you about the same or a little more long term, but you also got to go spend, $80 million or $100 million to go buy a fleet of 100 additive systems and get rid of all your capital equipment that you've already bought to do it the other way. Nobody's going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those situations where, maybe you can make a better part at about the same cost or a little bit less, but there's other forces that are really preventing the use of that technology that, aren't necessarily technical. They're more economic and have other things to consider too.
And to me, that gets back to the debate that we probably all have in our industry. There's kind of two polar opposing views. One is just because you can doesn't mean you should in terms of printing a device. And yet the other side of the coin is unless you try it, you don't know what's possible, and you won't potentially uncover an even better application or a better approach, kind of like the spinal approach. The hip cup opened the door to other applications to explore. If we can do this, then what about this? This is a bigger problem over here. Could we do that? So it's this give and take that has to happen to uncover where that value really is.
I definitely like getting people familiar with what additive can and can't do, and understanding the capability so that when the next project you're designing comes around, you're like, hey, this might be a good fit for that additive process. It could work for this. The hip cups, we just have to be patient, right? Because I honestly think like 10 years from now, 15 years from now, almost all hip cups probably will be made additively. We have to wait for these OEMs to get to a point where their equipment that they've invested millions of dollars in starts to get obsoleted, and it's time to reinvent the wheel and find new processes to make their acetabular cups. We'll start seeing them migrate towards additive, right? Everyone expected additive to take off a lot faster than it has.
And that's what makes this space, working in this space, so challenging, is because it's this constant dance between trying to get the best, quality, best unit economics, but also being cutting edge and consistent when it comes to design and performance, and those different topics. And I know there's a lot of other considerations there. They don't always play nicely with each other.
No, definitely not. Right. Boils down to, again, like all the other complementary processes you need to have in place. The more you're pushing the limits, the more likely you are to fail. So you have to have better quality controls. You have to invent new test methods, new ways of inspecting parts. There's so many additive projects that I've been exposed to over the years where you could make the part additive, but ultimately it ended up being a failed project because to qualify and inspect the part ended up costing more and was, it was just impossible, to a point where like nobody could get comfortable using additive to make the part quantify the output well enough, right? A lot of work needs to be done. It's the afterthought of, oh, how do we inspect this? How are we going to qualify this? Instead of trying to work on better techniques to do that kind of stuff in parallel with additive. We're really lucky to work in the space where we're making titanium parts that fit in the palm of your hand. Industrial CT scanning has matured along with additive manufacturing. I remember when I first started, we wanted to go get a lattice coupon made in additive Ti-6 for T-scan, and we needed a resolution in the single digits to 10 microns. We found someone who could do it, but it took them 8 or 9 hours of scan time to scan the part. Today, you can do that same scan in about 10 or 15 minutes.
And now it's time for layers of information.
And so there's applications now that are probably feasible in additive because we can CT scan so fast, right? It's not that additive has made any big jumps. It's that CT scanning has matured to a point where it's opened up new opportunities in additive.
I think that's a fantastic point to bring up, especially for people who might not be working in additive who are listening in. I think it's wise to keep checking in. Maybe you have a certain application or certain sector and you're trying to figure out, can additive work for it or not? And maybe you've tried it and it didn't work, but you should keep following up because sometimes those auxiliary processes catch up and all of a sudden it works. I had something similar when I worked with FDM technology. I remember printing foot orthotics and also AFO device. You could do it, but the performance of the material just wasn't there. You couldn't get that. Now, 6, 7, 8 years later, the technology with a slightly different printing process really works for it, and it's really taking off. But it took a while for some different processes and software and material approaches to catch up.
Yeah, I think another really good example of that is in situ build monitoring, right? That's been a buzzword for like 10 years in our industry. When RMS installed every single one of their printers, they've installed these 30-some printers over the course of 10 years. They went and spent a decent chunk of money to put in the monitoring hardware on all of these printers. And until about a year ago, it was all turned off, right? And the reason is it generated so much data that if we turned on all the monitoring systems on all of our printers, the IT department would have been knocking on our office door in about a matter of 10 minutes, right? And it was just like, we don't know what to do with this. It's a bunch of data and information, and it's relatively useless. But, with the advances, we're machine learning and AI and just general computing competencies, all of that has come to a point now where that information is starting to become useful for us. So we have those monitors turned on all of our systems now, but that's something that's changed in the last year.
Well, there's a company called SolidScape. They do wax 3D printers. They've had monitoring with a high resolution camera in their printers for quite a while, such that if the camera detects some printing error, it has the ability to erase the previous layer or layers and then rebuild it. It'll be interesting to see what kind of capabilities will manifest in the years to come, especially when you factor in AI to have almost like Big Brother type tendencies to look at a print and maybe make on the fly changes. I mean, it obviously depends on the technology, but you're exactly right. Especially with all the data that it generates, it just wasn't feasible to keep all that data.
It still isn't. We're still working towards it. Like I said, it takes about 8 weeks for us to get a product out our door. Right now, we can store about 2 weeks worth of build monitoring data, right? We're working towards 8 weeks by the end of this year. It's still so much data, and that's just keeping the important stuff. The machine learning at this point has been able to parse all the data and say, okay, none of this is interesting. This stuff might be interesting, without really being able to say, this is a problem. You need to make this change, which hopefully we get to a point where we'll be able to rely on that data. It's interesting or it's not. That alone has enabled us to use it a lot more than we used to. And now that allows us to capture that interesting data to try to build on it and learn what's interesting about it and hopefully make some more critical decisions with it in the future.
With your background in metallurgy, how do you feel like AI is going to change the way metals are produced or formulated? Have you considered any of that?
Oh, I don't know. It's a great question. Been some pretty good tools to do some of that stuff in the past, right? And AI is only as good as the information that it has available to it. And today, a lot of alloy development is very empirical. Whether AI takes some of that out of the equation, I don't know. Where it can be really beneficial is helping people do a better job with material selection. So, that's like an art in itself. Like, what's the best material to actually make this part out of? I think AI will be able to help people make those decisions a little bit better.
Do you see anything coming in to take over the titanium business that you guys have, or is titanium just going to be here for a long period of time?
It's always a concern. I mean, we're always developing new materials. Right now, we mostly run Ti-6-4, but we're looking at commercially pure titaniums, which historically haven't been made with additive in very large quantities. But there's been some metallurgical work done to show that as printed, commercially pure titanium is a pretty good material. That might eat into some of the Ti-6-4 applications long term, but it's still kind of the same. I think there's some work being done in ceramics that could be really interesting, that offer some interesting advantages over metals, right? I guess I look at it like that. What's going to maybe be the next thing to replace metals? It boils down to either resorbable type things. You got to keep in mind, most of the metal implants that we make, like spinal fusion cages, are kind of a temporary solution. If they do their jobs really well, bone grows in and through them, and they're just kind of there taking up space, and all the load and everything's being transferred through the bone. So the thought is, can you make an implant out of magnesium, which is a metal, but it's actually kind of resorbable too, right? It'd be temporary. Can you make an implant that's around long enough to allow the bone to grow in and through it, but then eventually goes away? That's really appealing to people. Bioprinting those types of things are also potential threats. You look at spinal fusion cages, they're almost all made out of either titanium alloy or PEEK, which is a polymer. There are some people that are additively manufacturing PEEK and PEC interbody fusion cages. It's still kind of slow to take off. Not sure if that'll ever really take over the industry.
Yeah, speaking of that, do you think eventually we'll be able to print reabsorbable materials instead of metals?
Eventually. I'll probably be retired or something by then, but for sure.
I've seen a lot of interesting materials from that perspective. Now, if you can manipulate it and actually print it in the format that you need, that's kind of another thing.
One of the nice things about titanium is it's a really known material. Most of the devices that are using additive titanium have been cleared through the FDA by a process called the 510K process, which is one of the more straightforward regulatory paths where you're basically saying, hey, I have a product that's equivalent or superior to something else that's already on the market for the same indication. I'm going to prove equivalence or superiority. And that's the avenue you take with the FDA. Once you can prove that, then you get a clearance. I think when you start talking about resorbable materials, they probably can't follow that same pathway. Somebody's going to have to invest in a lot more research and clinical trials to prove the viability of those types of applications. That's one of the hard things in this industry. Once somebody does it, everyone else can do it too, right? Because then they get to 510K their product off that predicate device. So yeah, it'll take some leaps of faith and some people willing to invest in figuring out how to prove to the FDA and regulatory bodies that these new materials and stuff are superior and work as well as the other stuff. But I imagine that'll eventually happen.
I have kind of I don't know if it's a silly question or not, but I'm curious how you might respond to it. Fairly frequently, I might have a prospective customer or someone working in the industry looking for a FDA-approved 3D printed material. How might you respond to something like that?
The FDA doesn't approve materials. Unless it's the material itself that's the device, the FDA doesn't really clear materials. But there's some validity to the thought process there, right? Knowing that the FDA has probably cleared a device made with a particular material at least gives you some confidence knowing that if you make your device with that same material, you can get it cleared, right? The FDA doesn't clear materials, they clear devices.
So just so we have it clear for the audience here, the FDA doesn't certify a material, they certify a device, correct?
Correct. At least in the context that we're talking about, right?
Yep.
Like you could consider pharmaceuticals a material, but that's outside of my expertise.
I just bring that up because it is, I'd say, a fairly common confusion. And it's probably not a fault of the person because, as you know, Brian, it can get logistically, legally, and process complicated when you get into this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm kind of fortunate that we're making metals, right? The metal that we're making is a well-known material with the FDA. Not only that, we piggybacked off of old standards and stuff and trying to show conformance to it. So there's no secrets what's in additively manufactured Ti-64, right? It's Ti-64. We know every single, down to the thousandths of what's in it, right? Parts per million of what's in that material. And so that's pretty straightforward. Where things get a little weird in additively manufactured polymers is that certain companies, a lot of their IP and value is associated with the material they're making and the exact composition of it and stuff like that. They don't necessarily want their customers and everybody to have access to all that information and visibility to what their exact formulation is. So there are some avenues within the FDA to facilitate that type of situation. It's called a master file. As a material manufacturer or a contract manufacturer, RMS has a handful of documents in a master file with the FDA where we can have some of our trade secrets and IP more associated with process validations. It's not material formulations, but you can have a master file with the FDA. It's a technical document that contains information the FDA needs to make a decision about the safety of a device. You don't necessarily want to share that with everybody. So in that situation, your customer can refer to the master file, say, we're getting this made by this company or it's made with this material. Please reference master file XYZ for more technical information. People might be confusing some terminology, but there are materials that have master files at the FDA that people can reference with the right permissions. They're not necessarily cleared by the FDA, but there are master files at the FDA. There's a device that's been cleared utilizing it, right?
That's a great point, Ryan. And just backing out a little bit further, let's say someone is listening in here and they've decided that they want to produce some medical device with an additively manufactured process. Maybe it's metal, maybe it's plastic, doesn't really matter. But maybe they don't have anyone in their company that really has any experience either going through that process, let alone with 3D. Given your 20 years of experience in this spot, how might you advise them to go about that based on your experience? Is there anything that you could say to them to help them avoid some potential pitfalls to try to get through that process faster or easier?
Are they already a medical device manufacturer or just trying to figure out, do they have additive experience?
Let's assume minimal additive experience. So we'll say less than 2 years of experience.
But do they have medical device manufacturing experience?
Let's assume that they do for this case.
Okay. In that case, I recommend their starting point should be that technical guidance document we talked about, right? Because ultimately, there's nothing unique about clearing a device made by additive manufacturing. You have to go through the exact same methodologies, assessments, and documentation that you have to go through with any other manufacturing process. It's just there's things that you may not be aware of as far as an additional risk or an additional process input that you hadn't thought about. Like for an example, like powder reuse or material reuse. Maybe it's not something you think about when you're machining things, right? So if you're a company that's used to machining medical devices, it would be nice, it's nice to know that, hey, I need to deal with and address how we're reusing material when I go through my process failure methods and effects analysis, right? That's what that guidance document's for. It's like, unless you're really experienced in additive, you probably haven't thought of these things. So make sure you think about these things and address them before you go and try to submit something to the FDA. That guidance document, in the hands of people who have good regulatory experience, is going to go a long way. If you don't have people who have good regulatory experience, you need to go find some. That's what it boils down to. Additive is just a manufacturing process. Where you find success in applications in medical is when you pair people with additive with people who have experience in regulatory quality. That's where a lot of projects end up failing, is because people don't have that experience. And there's consultants out there that can do it. Right now in the job market, there's a lot of people with those experiences looking for jobs, but it shouldn't be an afterthought. You shouldn't be hiring a quality and regulatory person as an afterthought after starting a medical device manufacturing company. That doesn't make any sense.
Good advice. One question that we ask everyone that comes on is, what is the application that you have been keeping an eye on or you think is pretty amazing that might have legs to turn into something, whether it's 3D printed or not? Is there something that you look at outside of your area or even within?
That's a really good question. I look forward to, at least from an additive standpoint, being able to commoditize metal additive. I like to think we're unique and special, and it's a really high-tech thing. But you look at how many CNC mills and people who have CNC mills in their garages and things like that. I'd really like to get to a point where we're doing that with metal. And I think we'll get there eventually. I think what's going to be really mind-boggling for me, and I've already started to see it, is the design capabilities that people have. So I think commoditizing design, where you don't have to be somebody who's an expert in SolidWorks to design something, you can kind of just be like, I have this idea, I'm going to go talk to ChatGPT and take a picture of something, and all of a sudden you have this cool design of something, right? I think that'll be really cool. I don't think it's a particular thing or application, but I think it's just going to be like a fundamental shift in how people design and manufacture things going forward. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about it all the time, that one of the biggest barriers is design, right? Being able to get it into everybody's hands will definitely grow in all different types of manufacturing, for sure.
We actually talk about that in a previous episode with Mac Cameron called To Be or Spoke Be. because he's working on a process just like you're talking about, where you don't need to be a CAD designer to manipulate a design. And I very much agree with you there.
Yeah. Everyone's always talked about you're going to have this like printer at your auto parts store or something like that, and you're going to take a picture of some part on your car and then they'll print it for you and you go pick it up. That one I think is a little bit of a pipe dream. I studied metallurgy in school, and I remember, taking some steel class or something, and a professor put up a slide on how many different steel alloys are in a car. And it's like, or how many different materials are in a car, and it's thousands, right? But I think the design thing is something that will become more commercialized. I think that was a big problem with this huge push. Everyone thought everyone was going to have a MakerBot or some sort of printer in their house. You can only make one material out of it, or 5 materials out of it, I guess. But there's so many materials in our world. It's still very limited. But the design stuff's really cool.
Absolutely. My last question is there a resource that you recommend people check out? Or it could be an event, website, or magazine.
Some of my favorite resources, let me see if I can find the official name of it. There's a magazine called Bone Zone. It's owned by ODT. I think the best, I'll put it in your guys' link. Maybe you can find a way of tagging it on the podcast or something. If you want to stay up in the Joneses of what's going on in orthopedic manufacturing, it's a really good resource. As silly as it sounds, LinkedIn is probably one of my best resources. I could give you a list of some interesting people to follow. That's where I get a lot of my technical information, believe it or not.
But it's a reoccurring area that people say to follow. Certain people, obviously, but it's good to see that there's still good information, right? It's not one of the social media areas.
You have to sort through stuff.
Right.
There's definitely stuff that isn't useful. But yeah, following the right people and building your network off of that. It seems to be one of those things where if you follow the right people, then your network expands to other interesting people and you can go off from there.
Speaking of right people, is there one person or two people that come to mind for you in particular?
There's a gentleman named Matt Schomper who's really interesting to follow. He is really into biomimicry and developing cool lattice and porous structures. I find him interesting because I've always considered myself kind of a boring additive person because I'm more focused on process and qualification and inspection and all that stuff. And I don't have a lot of good design ideas. Like I don't have that imagination. And so he's kind of the opposite of me. He comes up with some really crazy applications and designs. On the other end, there's a metallurgist from a company called Freemelt named Ulf Acklid, who always posts fascinating metallurgy stuff. And he's also a really good photographer. So sometimes he puts up really good photographs. So those are two of my favorite guys that I follow on LinkedIn.
Great.
Thanks for sharing.
And with that, thank you so much for your time. It was great to hear from someone on the medical side and get some of those insights. Thank you again for joining.
No problem, guys. Take care. Thanks for having me.
And we'll catch everyone again on AM Insider. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from AM Insider, you can follow us on LinkedIn at AM Insider or send us an email at justin@aminsider.org or dustin@aminsider.org. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.